these types by turning one type into another type. So let's try writing this, this new function here. Let's call it toString. And our toString is going to take 3 arguments, and we just pick 3 arbitrarily, A, B, and C, and they can be anything. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass those in, and for each of these we're going to turn them into strings and add them together. And so we have that, we commit that function, and then we run toString, and we just put an int, a float, and a string in here as parameters. And what we get back is a string of them all added together. Now if we hadn't done string on each of these, this one would have failed because it's an int trying to, well, you can add these two together, but you can't add this string to these two in this case. So we make everything a string, we add it together, and then we get this string output. So that's how we change types. So now I'm back to where I wanted to be again with moving on to talking about modules. And now all this stuff is great, built-in things, but it only gets you so far. So what they do in Python is they break out all this extra functionality into things called modules, which are like libraries. And they're broken up into logical categories. So here's one that you can import. And the way you import is with the import keyword. And there's one called math, and there's a whole list of them, and you can look them up online. But math is a good one that has all kinds of more advanced math functions. And you could get help on any of these. You could get help by just doing math and get the entire help, or you could pick one. And let's just get help on floor. And floor, what it does is you give it a value, and it gives you the closest lower integer value. So we're going to do math. We imported math like this, and that gives us the math module and the floor function. So I can put a number in here, and you can see that it gives me the closest lower integer. So even if I went to 99, it just basically lops it off to the closest, basically gives us back this, but it gives us a float. And they have the similar ceiling up to 4. So you can see that a module gives you all these extra functions. There's another one that's pretty useful called OS, and these are all kinds of operating system functions. All kinds of crazy stuff, a lot of these that you will not need to use, but you can look through the help and see what all this stuff does. I'm just going to hit Q, but I'm going to throw it out there that that's how you can look up all this stuff that it can do. You can make directories, you can remove directories, rename, all kinds of stuff you do on a file system. You can call out to commands by OS system. We don't need to get into that right now, but the idea here is that modules give you extra information, and that's what you will need when you go into Maya and you have to use Maya's modules with all the custom commands that it has. One other thing is just how you import. There's a couple ways. We did import OS, but you could also say import OS as some other name. And that just means that I imported OS, but I renamed it to something else. And that's useful if it's a really long name and you want to make it shorter. And one other thing is OS has another module inside it called path. So you could, it's just a subcategory. So you could import, actually, say we don't want the whole thing. We can say from OS import path. Now we just have the path module, not everything above it, and it's a lot shorter to type. By the way, path has a lot of just specific to working with file paths, like is it a link, is it a file, is it a directory. Let's try that real quick actually. Let's try is dir, and we'll give it something that I know, the user's directory. And it tells me true. And that's another type that I actually left off. That's a Boolean. It's either true or false. So we have bool That's another common type here, and that can be either true or false. So that's how you import modules, and we'll get into more of that when you get into Maya. And now I want to give you some examples of loops. Loops are ways you can do the same thing over and over again by changing the value. And the first basic way to do a loop is a for loop. And a for loop looks like this. You go for, and then you say what you want each item to be every time you loop. So I'm going to say I. Every time we go in a loop, I will be this current item. Now what can you loop over? You can loop over a list, you can loop over a string, you can loop over anything that's a container of values, a sequence of values. You can loop over a range of numbers, and there's actually a built-in command called range, and you can give it a number and it'll generate you a list that you can loop over. So those are different ways you can loop over something, but if you remember earlier, we had my list. Let's loop over that and print each value. So what we do is we do for I in, which means inside of, my list, and you remember the colon to go into it, because it's almost like a function, but we're going into it. So now this is going to go round and round for every value in my list, and I will be each value in this list. So let's just print I. And you can see that it went through every item in the list and it printed it out for you. So let's make this a little more interesting. Let's make a new list. Let's say new list equals an empty list. There's nothing in it. And let's say for I in my list. And let's say new equals I plus some more stuff. Now that might have a problem, because if you remember, you can't add strings to other things that aren't a string like that. So let's just make sure that this will be a string every time that we go around. So let's hit enter. And now we can keep going here. The first thing we've done is we've added whatever I is this time plus some more stuff. And now let's do new list. And if you remember, a method of a list is append, and we could have done that by doing the dir command and seeing what a list can do. But we're going to append this new item to our new list, and I'm going to hit enter. Now it didn't print anything because we didn't tell it to print, but let's print what our new list is, and you can see that it's every value from the first list plus some more stuff. So we've changed it. We've made a new list, and we could even change the list in place. If we loop over the same list, we could say my list. Actually, we need to do this slightly differently, which is good because we can get into looping a different way. So what we want to do is let's loop over the list and change each value in the list in place. So you remember that to get the length of a list, we can get the len. And I also told you that you can loop over a range like this. So if we put all that together, we can say len my list and then wrap that in a range. You see what I did here is I put, and you can put spaces like this, it's fine, len my list inside of a range. And now we've got something we could loop over, and I can say for I in range. Now I last time was each item in the list, but I this time is going to be each item in this list. So if we hit enter, I is going to be 0 this time. So if we say current value equals my list I, that means that it's going to pull that value out right now and save it in here. And now we're going to say new value equals current value. And remember, we want to make sure that this is a string, so let's wrap it in a string plus some more stuff. Now we also want to save it back over the original. So let's say my list I equals new value. Now if I hit enter, nothing happens. So now what do we expect to see? We looped over my list and we changed each value. You've overwritten the original list. So that's how you loop over a list and also a length of a list to get the number. So whatever you're looping over, that's what each item is every time. There's another type of loop called a while loop, and a while loop will run as long as the statement you give it is true. So you say while, and you give it a statement here. And what you can do is you can say I equals 1. We'll just start a counter at 1. And we say while I is, let's do it 9 times. So we'll say while I is less than 10, print I. Now what happened here? It's looping forever. It's never going to stop. I'm going to hit Control C and break it. Why did it not stop? Well, because I is always 1 the whole time. We never did anything to I. So we need to say print I, and we need to make sure I changes every time. So I can say I equals I plus 1. Now when it goes back around, I will be 2, and then it'll be 3, and then it'll be 4. And let's see what happens here. Now it works right. So we've got the for loop and the while loop. And you're seeing that we're doing a test here, which leads me into talking about how you test things. You still hanging in there with me? Alright, I know there's a lot of command line stuff, but we're just going to get through the basics here, and then we're going to move into the more graphical stuff. So let me just show you how to test something. And what you can see here is we have 1. And we can say 1 less than 10. That's asking a question. Yes, it is less than 10. Is it greater than 10? No, it's not greater than 10. You can test if something's equal. Now, why did we use a double? Because if we did a single, we're trying to do an assignment, and you can't say 1 is 10 because that's actually not even possible. But if you remember when we said x is 1, that's how you assign something. But then you can say, is it 1? It is 1. So using that, we can do something called the if statement. We can say if, and then we put a test here. If x equals 1, and you remember our colon, let's jump inside the if statement, print it's 1. See, and x was 1, so it printed it's 1. And you can have an alternative thing happen. Let's just say true. You can say if it's not 1, else, and this is anything else than 1, print false. And there you go. That's how you get the false statement. And you can even do multiple ones. You can say if x is 1, print blah, if, and that's a short way of saying else if. I know they could have said else if, but they made it elif. X is greater than 2, print true. And you don't even have to have another else. It just means nothing else will happen. So x was equal to 1, so it's blah. So now we know how to do if, else. These are how you test things. It's basically just testing if it's true or false. And you can also test a string. You can say if hello, print true. Now why did that print true? Well, that's because if hello is anything but an empty string, it's true. And each type of object has its true and false value. 0 or 1 is true or false. An empty string or something in it, that's true and false. An empty list versus a list with something in it, that's true and false. Same with a tuple, same with a dictionary. If there's nothing in it, then it's false. If we had a my list, so you can say if my list, print true. Yep. Now what if we did that on an empty list? Nothing, because it's not true. There's nothing in it. So that's how you can test if you have anything in your list or not. Now I think that this is pretty much all you need to know to get started messing around with Maya. These are all the basics. You can get a lot more by going to python.org. Do not go to python.com because you will see a lot of adult content, and I'm not responsible for that because I warned you. So don't go to python.com, go to python.org, and you can go to the documentation, and they've got things like the tutorials and library reference, language reference, and just basically getting more information on all the stuff that I've just been going over. But that's not really important to us at this point. That's for you to do in the future. So we're going to go ahead and move into Maya and start doing some more visual stuff. Home sweet home, much more comfortable, huh? So now you made it through the command line, you got your hammer. You got your hammer in your hand and you're swinging it around in the air and you're ready to build a birdhouse, but we're not going to build a birdhouse just yet. We're going to learn about the nails. I don't know where I'm going with this, but anyway, so we're in Maya and we're going to open up the script editor. And you may have opened the script editor before to check the output of what Maya is doing, but maybe never typed anything into it. But this is the primary area where you will be experimenting with your code. And it's got the Mel tab, it's got the Python tab, and you can use either language. Obviously we're learning Python, but Mel was the original language in Maya, the Maya expression language, and it's a much stricter language. It's not object oriented like we explained earlier. Everything is not as flexible, and you can't really accomplish quite as much. But with Python you get all kinds of extra functionality, like things working with the file system and all the great modules that have been written for Python, all the crazy stuff you can do with Python. So it's much more flexible, and you can even switch this one-liner down here to Python. It's a little hidden right there because my screen is small. But to show you the difference in Mel, if we do some things, let me first start by making sure that we're echoing all commands. This will spit out everything that we're doing here. But if I go here, and you see as I start to do operations, it's printing out a lot of stuff here, right? And it's printing out a lot more because I said to show everything. But what it's doing is it's running tons of Mel commands to execute everything that goes hand in hand with what I'm doing here in the UI. You see it created the sphere, it changed the UI over here to update, building all the nodes and making the selections, and we can look up higher. Let's see, let's go way up here, and you can see here's where it actually created the sphere, and this is Mel. This is Mel, and unfortunately it doesn't spit out Python. It still spits out Mel. So you can only see the results of Mel commands here, but this gives you an idea of what Mel looks like. You have a command, and then you have these flags that are all the options to create the sphere that I did visually. But let me scroll down to the bottom here, and I'm going to turn off echo all commands because that gets pretty messy, and I'm even going to clear this area. But the difference here is Mel versus Python, you have much more flexibility. Like I said, Python is the modern language that's cross-platform, so that's why we're sticking with Python over Mel. It's just, it gives you more flexibility. Now if you remember from the command line when I was talking about importing modules, that comes into play now in Maya, because whereas Mel was a native language where you can just start typing a command and it's ready to go, Python is an add-in to where you need to actually import the Maya Python module to give you all the commands. And the way we do that, if you remember our import command, the Maya module is actually called Maya, and a bunch of things live under Maya, but what we want is the command package, which gives us all the commands that have the equivalent Mel. So what it is import Maya commands, and that would bring in the package. But a very common way to do this more cleanly is to say from Maya commands. Actually, it's import Maya commands as commands, and I'm just going to hit the return key on the bottom right of the keyboard to send that command. And what that does is it imports Maya commands but just aliases the name to commands. So if I type commands and hit enter, it tells you that it's got the module Maya commands, and it even tells you where it grabbed it from off the file system. So we've got this commands module, and that's where we can actually run all of our Python commands. Now I told you before about the dir command to look inside of objects, and if we run that here, we'll see there is a ton of stuff, and this isn't really the best way to look at this. So I'm going to show you how you get your information about how to use the Maya commands module. Now let's get a couple settings going in the scripts editor here. Let's look under the history tab and make sure you have what I have checked. We want to see line numbers. We want to see stack trace. This is if you screw up stuff, you get errors. You'll get a nice output of what went wrong. And under the commands tab drop down, we want to show line numbers, and we also want to turn on command completion and object path completion, and we want to turn on the quick help. We don't want to turn on the tooltip because I think it's very annoying and it's not quite as helpful as it could be. So with those on, we get this nice help thing, this help tab on the side here, and we've got our commands. And what you can do is, the first way to get to help is under the help section. There's the MEL and the Python command reference, and if I open this up, it's going to open a web page. Now unfortunately I have Chrome as my default browser, and there's a little bug in Chrome where the search doesn't work right, so I'm just going to minimize this. I have it open already in Safari, but what this gives you is the entire language that's available to you. The commands reference. These are all the commands that you could possibly run with the Python module, and they have the MEL equivalents. So the things you see in the script editor spitting out, they have these same things here. If I type sphere, sphere, and I click on sphere, you get this full help screen of how to call the sphere command and all the options it takes, and it tells you that it returns a string. And now this is kind of some of the stuff that's still MEL-like, where these little brackets means it's an array, it's a list. So what you're going to get back is actually a list of object and nodes that it created. And here's all the flags. It tells you everything that you can do and the shorthand terms for the flags and what type of values they accept. So we have this reference. Let's go back to Maya. And let's work with that sphere command again. Now we're not going to do much with the sphere. We're just going to show you how to use the commands. If I type commands and I hit a period, because we know that's how we go into the commands, if I hit the control spacebar, you get this cool pop-up, and it tells you all the stuff you can do, just like in the web page. So let me hit backspace here. Actually, it's backspace. Dot sp. See, it's narrowing it down. Sphere. So it helps you find these commands in here. And one of the cool things is, now it's waiting for you to put the parameters in here for sphere, but I can click on sphere and I can right click and I can say quick help. And what this does over here is it gives me all those flags from the web page. Now the downside is it is still in MEL format. So Python doesn't use these dashes in front of the parameters. They just use the actual letter or the full word. But these tell you everything you can do, so they can give you a quick help. If you were using MEL, you would just double click and it would start putting them in for you, but we're not in MEL, so we can just use it as a reference. So you can get the name, and you can get all the other variables. See, a name takes a string. So that's how you would build up your parameters, and then you would run the commands. And to run the commands, you can select them, and you can hit. Now if you hit enter, it runs the command and then it goes away. But if you select everything and hit the bottom right return key, it runs your code and it still keeps the code here, which is really cool because you don't have to keep typing stuff. And when you're testing and you're running lots of code, you can select parts of it and hit the return key, and you can keep testing it over and over again. So how do we save and load our scripts? Well, if I have this code here, I can select it, and if I had a lot of code, I could select all of it, File, Save My Script, and we can go into my project, and I can create a new directory called Scripts, or wherever you want to save them for now. I'll go inside here and call it First Script. And I believe if you save it with that extension, it'll figure that out for you. So we've saved it. I'm going to delete this, and we can get our script back, or we can hand it out to other people. See, and we get our scripts back. So this is how we can build scripts and save it out. And if you notice, when you type in here, you get the benefit of this highlighting. It helps you see your code really well. And when you type a string, it turns nice colors, so you know when you have errors, when things don't line up properly. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate some of the things that we went over in the command line, and I'm just going to do them as examples here so you can see them in use. I'm going to do a new scene and clear this up here, and let's keep going with that sphere, and let's just see the concepts that we learned. So let's do commands, and then I remember Control spacebar. We can start narrowing it down. Sphere, right? Now some of the options that sphere takes. I'm going to pull back up the web page again, and some of the things we can set. We can set the radius, and we can see that the radius takes, now they call it linear, but they tell you here what it means. It takes a float value. It's any decimal number. It could be any number, really. It could be int or float. And then we can also find, we can find name. So we can set the name of the object it's going to make, and that takes a string. So let's go back over here, and what we do is we want to do name equals, and you remember strings are in quotes, let's call it my sphere. And then let's set the radius. Now you can either do the short name or the long name. If you look down here, radius can be R or radius. Sometimes it's nicer to type the whole thing so you can see what it does. Let's do a radius of 10.5. And we don't put that in quotes because this is a float. Now, remember I said if we highlight the whole thing, actually let's actually make sure we save. I remember telling if we run a function, we can save the output by saying my sphere equals. And we can call this anything we want. It's our variable. And we say equals, and then the result of this command will go into my sphere. And I'm going to select the whole thing, and I'm going to hit the return key, and it made a sphere, and it printed the command for you. And what you can do is, let's hit enter, print my sphere. Hit enter. Now what you get here is a list. Now these U's in front of this is it means Unicode, because these can have non-standard characters in here, and it supports Unicode. So don't worry about these U's right now. It's still a string. It's a special type of string. But these brackets mean that we got a list back, and it actually said from the help here that we get back, and I told you that this is the Mel way of saying a list. These little brackets, it gives you a list. And it told us the transform, and it told us the shape. And you can see over here that it called it my sphere for us. Now, and also a little tip is you don't have to type print. You can click anywhere on here and hit return, and it's a really cool way to replay any of these commands. It's almost like printing, so it's really nice to develop. So we've got my sphere in a list, and we've got these two names, and so we've illustrated a string, a float, a list return value. Here is a function call. These are the arguments, the name equals and the radius equals. So that's a lot of the things we just went over all in one there. And what I can do is I can add a 2 on here, run this again. Actually, I'm going to call this 2 as well. Run this again. It made another sphere. I kept them in the same spot, but it made 2 spheres. And if I hit enter on this, we've got a second set, right? And we didn't delete, we just kind of erased the text for it, but we still have this my sphere list. So we've got the first one,